had to keep 25% of deposits as reserves. So that sounds like a lot, right? Unfortunately, it was not as much as you think. The third tier had to keep 15%, but of this, 60% could be deposited in the top or second tier banks. Now, the requirements today seem worse, 10% on transaction deposits and 0% on time deposits. Maybe they're worse, but I'm not so sure about that. The problem was, the way things worked was, what did the top tier, the third tier banks do with their money? Well, I hope I said this. Yes. So what happened was that the banks, there was this thing called pyramiding of reserves, which had to be one of the dumber arrangements that we've had in the US financial system, where everybody got to count the same money as reserves. So the country banks, what they would do is they could keep their money on hand as reserves, or they could deposit it with the city banks and get 2% on it. Well, what would you do if you had the choice? 2% or 0%? Okay, you take the 2. But then the central bank, the city banks also got to count that money as reserves. So you get to double count the reserves. So then, when the country banks have to pull their money out because they have to give it back to the depositors, then the city banks also lose part of their reserves. Yeah.
Why is the source of the sweep against now?
I'm not sure if it's worse.
This is any reserves at all.
It's bad enough. You'll see, though, it's bad enough. It was bad enough.
Right.
Okay. So the outside banks had to pull reserves during this period of monetary stringency, and it's like there was no more money. The problem is there's nobody to step in to provide liquidity in the system. Now at least we have that. Then we have nothing. So what would happen? What would happen is, if there was an agricultural shock, heavy withdrawals of currency from the central reserve cities in the fall for crop moving purposes, and an increase in loan demand. And the pyramiding of reserves meant the money supply contracted even more. And that was when you needed more money, that's when the supply would contract. So what would happen, of course, is interest rates would spike, and the city banks would have to call on their loans, mostly from speculators. All right, so what do you get? Large withdrawal forces banks to call in loans, some of which were used to buy stock on margin. Other banks might call on their loans, get bank runs, interest rate spikes, maybe balance sheet effects, and a reduction in economic activity because of lending for corporate activity closed off. So that's back to this commercial paper business that we started with. And an associated stock market crash. Now, none of these crashes really persisted for a long time because it was short. Every one of them was pretty short, a few months. Now, that didn't mean that the expectation was that it had to be short. It just meant the realization it happened during the national banking period that none of these were really protracted periods of high interest rates and stock market declines. Of course, there was always the possibility of that, and that would lead asset prices to decline. Just an expectation of the possibility. All right. So here's an example of a panic. This is not the best example for. I probably should have chosen the panic of 1873, which was a bad one too. But the panic of 1907 was not agriculture-driven, although it did happen in the fall. Although, if we pull it out from our data, the results still hold, because it's not all driven by the panic of 1907. This guy, Otto Heinz, tried to corner the copper market, and he failed. And he got some of his buddies, particularly those at Knickerbocker Trust, to lend money for this scheme. But he couldn't pay it back, because he failed to corner the copper market. It's hard to corner the copper market, I guess. For those of you old enough to remember, there was a similar episode occurred in the Underdog cartoon, where in fact, Simon Bar Sinister tried to corner the water market in sort of the same way. He managed to reduce the size, for example, of the Atlantic Ocean to a mere vial and put it in his office. So that didn't work either. It was also thwarted, just like Otto Heinz. So what happened was, when this failure happened, a lot of these banks failed, led to a large decline in stock prices, and one of them, yeah?
Trust companies.
Trust.
More the trust companies in New York, not the banks.
Fair enough. Most severe recessions in U.S. history, but it was short, really short. Okay? J.P. Morgan basically got his buddies together and said, look, you're going to inject money into the financial system, and you're going to do it now. And I think it was about $50 million at the time he got his buddies together to inject.
He locked them in the library. He locked them in his library along with
that's right.
trust companies, but they were going to help out.
It worked.
Yeah.
But Congress realized they couldn't count on J.P. Morgan all the time to do this.
Banks realized they couldn't do it again next time.
So we have, yeah, so basically it took them about 5 years to figure out how to have a central bank. Even though we had one before, it took us, there was sort of a 5-year study period. And in the end, we had the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And now we have the Fed. Okay. So what about in the Brunemeyer and Peterson model? How does this all work out for us? We start with shocks to the call loan rate. Should cause stock price declines as speculators have bought on margin unwind. Stock price declines because costs of providing liquidity rise. They also decline potentially through the balance sheet channel. And you can also see increases in spreads and decreases in volume because costs of liquidity rise. And the last thing Brunemeyer and Peterson say, although it's not obvious that this has to happen, is that the effects should be nonlinear. I mean, it seems intuitive that that's true, but that doesn't mean it has to be true. You know, our economic environment is not exactly the same as the Brunemeyer and Peterson model, but it can't be. So, what do we do? So I guess I have a few minutes to say what we actually did now. All right, so the first thing is we say, the first thing we do is we look at interest rate volatility. So really what's going on is the reason for the volatility, there's this paper by Meyer and there's another paper by Mankiw on this, where they look actually at mean interest rates in the fall. Think, well, why should it be the means? It's really not the mean interest rates, that's the problem. It's really the variation in interest rates that there's this possibility ex ante that there's going to be a spike, and sometimes there is and sometimes there's not. So what we do is we look cross-sectionally. We look at all the Septembers and Octobers, and we look to see if there's a lot more variation across Septembers and Octobers than there is across other months. And that's basically our look at interest rates. So it's not the volatility within the month. Look, if there's a crisis, interest rates go up. Maybe they go up on the 3rd day of the month by the 10th. It's not like they're bouncing around. They're high on the 3rd, they're high on the 10th, they're high on the 23rd. But next year, if there's not a crisis, there won't be nothing. So we're looking across Septembers and Octobers. And we do the same thing for the rest of the year. And then there's a bunch of other tests that we look at. We say, well, you know, is January different from February? Is the spring a problem? Well, it turns out the spring's not really a problem, even though there's a planting season then. So that's not that big an effect. So it's not statistically significant. In fact, we can't reject that all the other months look like each other. But September and October, they look different. So we did all that stuff that you have to do in an academic paper, just to make sure that it's not that if you took any 2 months you would find this, but actually it's those 2 months. So what we do is we say interest rates are going to be more variable across harvest seasons, but that's only going to be the case when there's no lender of last resort, because if there is, then there's somebody who can inject liquidity into this financial system, and that's going to prevent the problem from happening in the first place. So what do we look at? So the first thing is, and of course there's other things that could happen. It may lower overall volatility. So if you look at this thing, here's before, here's the panic of 1873, which is kind of big. Here's the panic of 1907, which is dwarfed by the panic of 1873. This panic may be foreshadowing, by the way, of exactly 100 years later. Never mind. It's not a good joke. This is after, you can see there, it looks like there's a lot less volatility. These little spikes, some of these are financial crises where, I mean, they're not all, because they're not all in September and October. Now we have a formal test for that, not just stare. The graph's not good enough. You can't just stare at the graph. We can do better than that. Of course, lots of other things were happening in the financial system, so we don't like to look at the time series. I just want you to see what the data look like. So then, we look at average interest rates for 1870 to 1908 and after. And you can see that in terms of the average, there's nothing particularly amazing about September and October. They're a little bit higher, not as high as December. I think statistically speaking, I'm not even sure if statistically speaking, September and October are higher than the rest of the year. I don't think they are, which is no surprise because, as you know from basic statistics, you can't estimate the mean of anything with any accuracy. So you're not going to find really an effect with the mean anyway. But the volatility. Okay. So here's our first result here. So this is just, we started out in 1870, so we got rid of the Civil War. With commercial paper, we'll be able to go back a little further. We have a similar table for commercial paper, but I just have to call one through here. So if you look, you can see September and October, 6.84% annualized is the volatility. but it's only 2.63 the rest of the year. And even